The slow, humid breath of old Florida whispers to the palmetto colonies standing together on both sides of the road, in small groups, like queen's maidens, gossiping into their fan-shaped fronds, sharp edges rustling a warning into the faintly coastal breeze. Parrish, Florida in 1957 moved slowly, like the shadows cast by the tall oaks as the sun makes its way across the sky. Gettis Lee was described in one newspaper account as a short, stumpy man of 63. His last known activity on March 7th was a dinner date with his mistress at the cozy house that he had built for her in Bradenton. According to Eunice Snyder, young enough to be his daughter at 27, Gettis Lee gave her a call to see if she was up for company. He had been popping in as of late, unannounced, a suspicious inkling having begun to tickle at the back of his neck. Eunice would later tell police that when Gettis called, she told him she was too tired to cook, but he could swing by if he wanted to provide dinner. At 6:30 p.m., Mr. Durrance heard Gettis Lee call Betty's Lunch, a local diner in Bradenton, and order 3 chicken dinners. Gettis Lee was a man of routine. Every day he opened his general store in Parrish by 6:30 in the morning. It was located less than a mile from his home, near the intersection of US 301 and State Road 62, which was also known as Erie Road. Around noon each day, Gettis Lee would go home and eat with his wife at their modest bungalow. It had a tidy, well-maintained yard. They would eat their biggest meal of the day in the afternoon together. If he had been out the night before, Lee might take a short nap, and then after an hour or so he would return to the store to finish out the day, around 6:30 in the evening. On March 7th at closing time, Gettis Lee and Donald Durrance, his 27-year-old store clerk and butcher, were just about to leave when a last-minute customer rolled in needing a gasoline fill-up. At home, Merrill Lee was the picture of quiet resignation, while her husband was the unofficial mayor of Parrish, flashing cash and turning deals for profit. She stayed tucked away in the shadows, gardening and television, her only refuge from the stillness. Due to a hysterectomy after a couple of miscarriages early in their marriage, the Lees never had children. It was just the two of them, a marriage built on the brittle bones of habit. He gave her whatever she asked for, but she didn't ask for much. Because of the last-minute customer that day, Gettis Lee got the store locked up a little later than usual. At about 6:45, he offered Donald Durrance a ride, and then dropped him off near Whidden's grocery store down the street, where he lived in an apartment with his wife, Christine. As he got out of the car that day, Donald Durrance watched Gettis Lee open the glove compartment of his 1957 Chevrolet and put a zippered bank bag inside. Gettis Lee frequently carried money with him, a habit born from a past robbery of his store. He carried a gun with him, too, usually sitting right next to him in the front seat, along with his bag of money. That night, he had about $1,600 in cash and about $1,000 in checks that he had cashed for people throughout the day. Lee's route toward Bradenton would take him southwest through Ellington, into downtown Palmetto, and then south over the Manatee River via the Green Bridge. It was a 25-minute or so drive where he could collect his thoughts and watch the scenery wash past him. Around 7:20, Gettis rolled into Betty's Lunch, owned by Betty and Bud Rhodes. The place was wildly popular, specializing in home-cooked meals. Among the local favorites, their delicious fried chicken and chocolate pie. Bertie Dees watched Gettis Lee settle in as she boxed up his dinners. She never minded waiting on him. He was always a good tipper. Bertie carried the 3 boxes over and set them on the table in front of him, where he had taken a seat when he entered. She asked him if he'd like dessert to go with his dinner order. At first, Gettis declined, but he was easily persuaded to add a slice of apple and a slice of pecan to his order. Bertie went back and grabbed one of each, boxed them up, and then followed him out to his car, carrying the desserts. Service with a smile. Gettis was parked right in front of the diner, and while he tucked the boxed dinners into the front passenger seat, he asked Bertie if she'd like to leave with him. She said she sure would, If only she didn't have to work. Gettis smiled and pulled a wad of money out of his shirt pocket, peeling off $1 and handing it to her. It might as well have been his signature move. Gettis Lee always had a wad in his shirt pocket, and he never missed a chance to flirt with a pretty woman. Bertie waved and watched the man wearing the hat pull out of the parking lot. She knew where he was headed. His relationship with Eunice Snyder wasn't a secret. Everyone knew. Back in Parrish, Merrill Lee settled in for another night alone. Her world wrapped in acres of citrus trees, creeping close enough to whisper things she didn't want to hear. That night she pulled the blanket around her a little tighter as she sat on the davenport across from the TV to distract her from the storm, tightening its grip outside. Earlier that afternoon she had been given 2 plants by her neighbor, Lunette Gillette, and she was glad that she had immediately planted them. They were about to get a good watering. The wind howled that night in Bradenton, clocking nearly 70 miles an hour, rattling windows and shaking loose long-buried fears. At 9:15 p.m., Duran Murray, conductor for the Seaboard Railroad, pulled his charge out of Palmetto Junction and headed east in the direction of Durant and Plant City. At 9:25 p.m., from his compartment above the caboose, the lights of the train illuminated a vehicle parked on Erie Road, a 1953 or 54 two-tone green Mercury hardtop. According to Eunice Snyder, Gettis Lee left her house that night around 9 p.m. If she was truthful about them all eating together and watching some television, maybe her father's presence put a damper on any itch that Gettis Lee had wished to scratch that evening. Mrs. Virginia Amos and her friend, Mrs. Parrish, who was keeping her company that night, chatted as they drove around Bradenton, but the weather began to pick up, palm branches skittering over the streets in the wind. When it started to rain, the ladies decided it was time to head home. They stopped at a red light on the corner of 10th Street and Manatee Avenue around 9:10 or 9:15, and who should roll up right across from them but Gettis Lee. He stopped at that same intersection, headed towards Palmetto. Virginia greeted him briefly before the light changed. He waved and she waved back as he made that turn onto 10th Street, headed toward the Green Bridge. That was the last time that Gettis Lee would be seen by anyone but those who meant him harm. At that point, things with Eunice hadn't been great. He didn't trust her. One imagines a quiet drive deep in thought, as the wind whipped tree branches into the road ahead of him. The rain came in fits and starts, sheets then drizzle, as the windshield wipers rallied. Puddles formed in the dappled earth and the ditches became sodden, glistening beneath the moon. Familiar fence posts stretched out further than felt right. Spanish moss lashed out as branches genuflected toward the earth in deep grieving moans. Someone's porch light flickering, and old Florida closing in behind him. Later that night, back in Palmetto around 11:30 or 11:45, Benny Groover, who had been out for the evening, swung by his father's supermarket to check on the place. The year before, they had purchased a new building, not far from the old one, on the same parcel of land. But he noticed a car parked alongside the old building, about 8 or 10 feet from it, facing north. The car was empty, and because he saw no one around, he didn't think much of it as he headed home. By the time Merrill Lee was found, 2 days after the Lees went missing, face down in a ditch, in the area where the train conductor had seen that vehicle parked, the incessant wind and rain had already transformed the sandy road into mud, washing away whatever fragile truths might have lingered on Erie Road. Despite the rain, or perhaps because of it, a large spot of blood had soaked clean through the surface of the dirt to the hard pan below, suggesting to law enforcement that Merrill Lee's killer or killers might have taken a moment to consider their next move. Donald Allison Durrance had worked as a butcher in Gettis Lee's store for about a year before Lee was killed. Durrance said Lee treated him well, but he did not gladly suffer fools or drunks. When it came to salesmen, Gettis Lee was friendly, as long as they were prepared. "I always had my order book open when I stepped into the store," one former grocery salesman said. "The minute I hit the door, Lee would start giving me his order. And if I missed an item, there was no use asking him to repeat it. 'Skip it,' he'd reply. Or, 'I didn't say anything.' And then he'd continue with his order." Gettis Lee spent less time in the store earlier in the week, but he was always there on the weekends. And he routinely called his wife, Merrill Lee, before going home, both at lunch and in the evening. He spoke to his girlfriend, Eunice Snyder, on the phone often as well. Often enough that customers recalled hearing parts of their conversations. On Thursday, March 7th, 1957, Gettis Lee opened the store early, just like clockwork, and then left around 9 a.m. He stopped by the bank in Bradenton that afternoon, and he popped into the barber for his regular trim. Sometimes he'd have his hair tinted, but his trims were like clockwork also, every 10 days. Durant's left for lunch around midday. When he returned, Gettis went home to eat with Merrill. Plans to take his wife to the movies fell through, the chicken dinners got ordered by phone, a late gas customer rolled in, and the store shut its doors around 6:45 p.m. The next morning, Friday, March 8th, Durant's showed up to the store at 7 a.m. sharp. The doors were locked. That was off. Real off. Gettis Lee was never late. Then he drove to Gettis Lee's house. He stopped in the driveway and walked up and rang the front bell. No answer. But there were lights on inside the house, which added to his level of concern. Durant's returned to the store. He unlocked the door with his own key and he went inside, and then he called Gettis Lee's mother, but no one answered at her house. He then called Mr. Roberts, the husband of Lee's sister Nettie. They hadn't seen Gettis either. Out of options and growing more concerned by the minute, Donald Durant called Manatee County Sheriff's Office. Now, Gettis Lee's sister, Nettie Roberts, hopped in her car and headed over to her brother's house as soon as she hung up with Durant's. And the first thing she noticed when she pulled in the driveway was that the garage door was open and the light was on in the garage, but her brother's vehicle was not inside. She entered the house through the garage. There was a screen door into the kitchen, and it was closed but not hooked from the inside. However, the wooden door, just inside that screen door, was slightly ajar. The kitchen light was on, and so was a small light over the television. There were 2 dishes on the kitchen table, one containing the remnants of soup, the other a few pieces of spinach, which Nettie knew to be one of Merrill's favorite foods. There was also a box of soda crackers on the table. She assumed that these were the remnants of Merrill's dinner, because she usually had a large noon meal and something lighter at night. The Lees generally ate dinner together around 7 p.m. after he returned home from the store. Nettie pulled open the dishwasher, a significant luxury appliance at the time. There was nothing inside, clean or dirty, so Nettie figured Merrill must have washed the noon dishes and put them away. Then she crossed through the living room and picked up a copy of the Bradenton Herald that was neatly folded on a footstool. She checked the date, yesterday's paper. Gettis hadn't had a chance to read through it. It didn't even look like it had been opened. There was another folded paper sitting on a coffee table by the couch, where Merrill usually sat, and it was open to the TV schedule for the 7th. A pair of Merrill's house shoes sat on the floor in front of the Davenport, as if she had just stepped out of them and sat down. In the middle of the couch in a pile was the blanket that she used to cover herself with when she relaxed to watch TV. Gettis and Merrill Lee slept in separate bedrooms, so Nettie checked both, finding nothing disturbed or disarranged. Neither bed looked slept in to her. She checked all the other doors, and they were all locked. Merrill always kept them locked, except the door leading from the kitchen to the back porch, which was open, but the screen door was hooked from inside as usual. The house told a story that didn't make sense. So Nettie returned home and phoned the sheriff's office, requesting that a deputy go to the Lee home immediately. That would have been the second call to the Manatee County Sheriff's Office that morning. Figuring it would take a few minutes for them to arrive, Nettie fixed breakfast for her husband, ate a quick bite herself, and then the two returned to the Lee home together about 8:45. Deputy Clyde Cruz of the Manatee County Sheriff's Office said he arrived at 8:47 a.m. When they made their way to Merrill Lee's room, Deputy Cruz said that he saw a woman's belt rolled up on the floor between the bed and the chest of drawers. Of the bed, Cruz said that the sheets and blankets had been turned back from the head in a V shape, as if someone had stepped out of the bed. He noticed a tissue paper near the slightly disarranged pillow, and he sniffed it. He said it smelled like Vicks Vapor Rub. He concluded, unlike Gettis Lee's sister, that someone had, quote, spent some time in the bed, but he saw no indication of a struggle, just someone who had leisurely gotten up for the bed. Deputy Cruz said he noticed a small woman's purse on the dresser that was open and completely empty. There was a vacuum cleaner on the floor half under the bed. Gettis' room was in perfect order. His bed had not been slept in. Outside, Deputy Cruz said he noticed a set of tire tracks near the garage and in the driveway, although he believed them to be Nettie's car tracks. With nothing more that could be done at the moment, the house was locked up and everyone left. Later that same afternoon, Sheriff Roy Bodden and Deputy Sheriff Clyde Gill, the second Deputy Clyde in our story, went to the scene to inspect the house. Strangely, upon finding it locked, they decided to enter through a window using a coat hanger to unlock and remove the screen, rather than reach out to family to get a key. In Merrill Lee's room, they found the bed sheets piled in the middle of the bed. They would later learn that it was Deputy Cruz who had pawed through the bed linens and left them in a pile, although Cruz failed to mention that during his retelling 6 months later. 6 months later, it would be learned that there weren't any reports made for quite some time, not until agents with the Florida Sheriff's Bureau stepped in. In between, there was a fair amount of passing the buck and jockeying for the best media quote of the day between the embattled sheriff and the state attorney, Max Smiley. All the Florida Sheriff's Bureau, or FSB, had to work with as far as what law enforcement had done were their oral regurgitations 6 months after the fact and a radio log with 3 stiff entries.
March 8:57 at 8:47 a.m. Station was called by Deputy Cruz, who checked out of service at the Gettis Lee home at the time of the call. March 8:57, 11:31 a.m. Palmetto PD unit called the station to ask for the location of Deputy Cruz. Station advised unit that they thought Cruz was still at the Lee home. March 9th, the next day, 12:42 p.m. Sheriff Bodden and Smiley and Chief Britt are at the hospital. They found Mrs. Lee, but nothing on Mr. Lee.
The whole thing started to stink of stale cigarettes and bad bookkeeping. No incident report. No proper scene details. No list of responders. Not a single written statement from witnesses. Just a handful of foggy recollections coughed up by members of the Manatee County Sheriff's Office 6 months after the fact, like they were trying to remember where they left a set of car keys instead of investigating a murder. Sheriff Bodden told the FSB that Smiley had whatever paperwork existed. Smiley had led that investigation according to the newspaper reports, although it's unclear if that was standard operating procedure in 1957 for a double homicide, or if there were other motivations at play. Sheriff Bodden assured the agents that he'd have Deputy Clyde Gill hand over all information concerning their investigational activities as soon as it could be transcribed. Transcribed. Such a scholarly word. Like monks writing manuscripts by candlelight with quill and ink. Most departments keep records on paper. Apparently, the Manatee County Sheriff's Office preferred storing vital investigative details in the soft gray filing cabinets between their ears. I mean, why bother with paperwork when you can leave a nice little scavenger hunt for the cold case boys 20 years down the line, right? Deputy Gill, Bodden's second in command, didn't even know Mrs. Lee's body had been found until after it was already hauled off to the hospital. Sarasota FBI agents worked that scene. Gill hadn't even laid eyes on it. Which begs the question, how did the FBI boys get there so fast? And at whose behest? Same story with Gettis Lee's car, parked outside Groover's old store. Bullet holes punched through his hat like unpaid tabs at a dockside bar. It rested on the back seat. The holes were through the brim and the rear of the crown, having penetrated the sweatband where the leather bow was tied. No blood, no powder burns, just some lead particles found on it. Also in the back seat a gray coat and a long-sleeved plaid sports shirt. No money bag, no gun, no Gettis. Just a passenger window cracked open an inch. Maybe for a smoker. Or maybe for someone who enjoyed a little night air with their violent felonies. Unfortunately, Merrill Lee's murder site on Erie Road wasn't closed off until Sunday morning, March 10th, about 24 hours after her body was found, leaving the area wide open for, quote, hundreds of the curious, the official, and semi-official, according to the press, to traipse through the area like it was a flea market. Deputy Gill went to the scene Sunday and sifted through the sand hunting for bullets and discarded weapons. And miracle of miracles, he found one spent .38 caliber slug buried right there in the blood-soaked ground where Merrill Lee had clearly laid for a bit before being rolled or dragged into the ditch. They were short, 3 bullets. Did they miss them, or were those shots fired elsewhere? That was one of many questions that would never be answered. The unofficial mayor of Parrish was nowhere to be found. His wife's body was dumped a mile or so from her house in a ditch, in a town of 600 people, and nobody's writing anything down? A lot didn't sit right about this case right from the start. But for Donald Durrance, what stuck in his gut, like a bowl of congealed oatmeal, was that package. Before disappearing, Gettis had asked him for a favor. If anything happened to him, deliver it to Eunice Snyder. Shortly after Gettis Lee was reported missing, but before Merrill Lee's body had even been found, Eunice Snyder called Durrance and asked whether he had a package for her. He said that he did. "That's good. I may need you," she told him. Durrance had no idea what the hell she meant by that, and frankly, he wanted no part of it. Turns out Gettis had prepared similar packages for 2 other former employees over the years, Preacher Clements being one. But before any of the packages could be delivered to Eunice Snyder, Gettis Lee's sisters caught wind of it. They marched down to the store and demanded the envelope be turned over to them. They accused Donald Durrance of withholding evidence, so he handed it over to them, and they left with it. They brought it back to him the next day. It had been opened. For reasons unknown, but most certainly involving politics, 6 months after the murder of Merrill Lee and the disappearance of her husband, Gettis Lee, Manatee County Sheriff Roy Bodden made a written request of the Florida Sheriff's Bureau, known as the FSB, to take up the investigation into the Lee matter. The case was a hot potato, and Bodden had his share of Idahos already. He didn't need the weight of that boondoggle around his neck. The feds were conducting a separate inquiry, trying to decide whether any federal laws had been violated. They also processed all of the physical evidence under the direction of FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. On September 24, 1957, a private conference was held at the sheriff's office with 5 special agents with the FSB. The first 2 weeks were devoted to recording and analysis of the physical evidence, and after that evaluation it was mutually believed among the group that based on what they'd learned from the sheriff's office, there was a pit located between Parrish and Ellenton that they felt needed to be drained and searched for the body of Gettis Lee. The pit in question sat about a mile north of Ellenton, Florida, minding its own business like every suspicious body of water in a crime story eventually does. No single incident more accurately reflects the state of the Lee investigation, quite like the draining of the Queen City pit. A caper so soggy, expensive, and gloriously ill-fated, it could have been cooked up by a screenwriter 3 bourbons deep at 2 a.m. So here's the backstory. About a month earlier, in August of '57, 5 months after the Lees disappeared, 2 fishermen stumbled onto what can only be described as a gob of nightmare fuel glued to a willow tree near some alleged bloodstains. The fishermen hauled the goo onto the shore with a stick and immediately got a whiff of something so foul they associated it with decaying human flesh. Several folks claimed they had seen bloodstains on the bank of the pit shortly after the Lees vanished. And not 1 or 2 people, mind you. 9. That's enough witnesses to start a church committee. And one of those witnesses owned a boat that was beached about 15 feet from where the alleged blood and goo had been spotted, and its anchor and some rope had been stolen. Nothing says, nothing to see here, folks, quite like mystery stains beside a dark Florida pit where an anchor that could potentially be used to weigh down a body is stolen. Especially when another witness comes forward to say that they had seen headlights weaving through the trees around the pit the night that the 2 victims went missing. The sheriff didn't think it was blood, but he instructed his deputy to collect it. Sheriff Roy Bodden later explained that after hearing the reports of the bloodstains, he had sent Deputy Clyde Cruz to collect samples. Cruz then returned carrying a cigar box full of dirt. Bodden and Cruz insisted that they had shown the soil to State Attorney Smiley, who reportedly shrugged and said he didn't think it was blood either. But when they asked Smiley, he told the FSB he didn't remember ever being shown the soil. After a few days, the cigar box and its mysterious contents were trashed. Already the investigation was running with the precision of a 3-legged greyhound. Nevertheless, based on this foggy chain of recollections and the general sense that something sure smelled foul, the Florida Sheriff's Bureau recommended draining the Queen City pit immediately. Engineers from the State Road Department estimated that they could lower the water level more than 6 feet by digging a drainage canal to a culvert under US 301 and letting the water flow into the Manatee River. They figured it would take 3 days and cost around $300. Words destined to haunt taxpayers forever. State Attorney Smiley appeared before the Board of Commissioners to request funds for the ill-fated operation. He estimated the entire thing could be completed for about $1,000. The commissioners, perhaps sensing destiny, approved $2,500. Work began in October under Sheriff Bodden's direction. The Manatee County Mosquito Control Unit rolled in with a dragline because apparently even the mosquitoes wanted in on the action. A drainage ditch was completed in 4 days and the water started flowing out the next day. Once the level dropped nearly 7 feet, pumps ran around the clock, pounding and pulsing throughout the night. When the pumps could do no more, they brought in an army duck, an amphibious military vehicle that sounds made up but absolutely isn't. It was used to remove the remaining water. Now came the unpleasant part, searching the bottom. The head of the Tampa Rescue Squad advised investigators to focus on the area where the goo and bloodstains had been reported, because he said that a body dumped in the pit might have risen and drifted anywhere due to decomposition gases, essentially putting the whole pit in play. And it wasn't a small pit. Unfortunately, draining the water only revealed a new enemy: mud. Vast, bottomless, soul-destroying mud. Enter the dredging expert with 20 years of experience and probably the exhausted expression to prove it. After studying the pit for 2 days, he concluded that the investigators had themselves, quote, a vast project. Some areas contained 4 feet of silt, and fully searching the pit would require moving 40,000 cubic yards of muck. He suggested manually dragging rakes across the bottom or flushing the silt toward a sump pump with high-pressure hoses. So naturally they called in another expert. A pump specialist recommended using equipment with enough force to blast the mud loose. Something like a fire truck. The trouble was, acquiring that kind of machinery cost money, and by then the county's wallet had flatlined. Right on time, Sheriff Bodden began backpedaling from the operation, like a man realizing the roulette wheel had eaten his mortgage payment. He told newspapers that he had only agreed to drain the pit. The rest of the fiasco, he implied, belonged to Smiley. Smiley, however, was still charging forward, intent on making something out of the muck. He bought 8 plastic wading suits and announced plans to drag the pit manually in the 2 target areas. 3 FBI agents, bless their hearts, and 1 Sheriff's Bureau agent climbed into the suits and entered the muck. The silt, meanwhile, had hardened into a consistency somewhere between wet cement and Satan's gruel. Progress became impossible, and the search was abandoned. Finally, in one last magnificent act of desperation, State Attorney Max Miley got permission to bring in 50 state prisoners. Screens were set up along the banks, while long human chains of convicts passed buckets of muck hand to hand as FBI agents and Sheriff's Bureau personnel sifted through the sludge for evidence. After all of the draining, dredging, pumping, wading, digging, hauling, sifting, and bureaucratic finger-pointing, the grand result of the Queen City pit operation was that absolutely nothing of value was found. The bulk of the information that we have about this case, because the original investigators didn't write anything down, comes directly from William McKinley Smiley, state attorney with the 12th Judicial Circuit. When he sat down with the Florida Sheriff's Bureau for his interview, he told them that he didn't have a report covering the investigative activities from March 7th to that date, but he would be happy to dictate a complete report and submit it.
On Friday afternoon, March 8, 1957, I came into the office of the Sheriff of Manatee County from Sarasota. I noticed FBI agents McVeigh and Byers in the office, and that there was considerable concern among the people in the office. Someone asked me if I knew that Gettis Lee and his wife from Parrish had disappeared and cannot be found, and related to me that since the lights were on at their house, something had probably happened to them. Perhaps robbery. The FBI agents went out about the time I came in, and I went in the office to talk to the sheriff. At that moment, which was in the neighborhood of 5 o'clock p.m., someone called in the sheriff's office and asked the tag number of Gettis Lee's car. The sheriff informed them what the number was, and the person, who later turned out to be a bread salesman, said it was parked by Groover's old store. The sheriff and I went to the Groover store and found that FBI agents McVeigh and Byers were already at the car. The car was locked. We looked around to see if the keys were anywhere in the vicinity of the car, even up on the roof of the building adjoining. And the sheriff was able to jimmy the right-hand front door open, and a key, which would fit the trunk, was found in the glove compartment. We looked in the trunk, and then made arrangements to have the car towed to Ogle's garage and stored. The car was parked facing a northerly direction along the side of the building and probably 8 to 10 feet away from the building. I, at the time, recalled that it had rained rather hard the night before, and that the wind had blown hard. The wheels on the left side, which were on the westerly side, were washed fairly clean by the rain. The wheels on the other side apparently had not been hit by the wind and rain, and bore evidence of the sandy, loamy soil of the type that you'd find on Erie Road or on the road leading to the pit just west of 301 and north of Ellington. While we were at the scene, Sheriff Bodden went to the Groover store, which was a new store and probably 100 yards or thereabouts from where the car was found. He came back and related that Mr. Groover's son had come in that Thursday night and saw the car belonging to Gettis Lee parked at this same spot where it was found at 11:45 p.m. Thursday. I either went in the Lee home later that night or the next morning. I noticed that in the garage there was evidence of the fact that a car had entered there with wet sand on the wheels. There did not appear to be anything disturbed in the house, except that we were informed that on Friday morning, Deputy Sheriff Cruz of the Sheriff's Office went in the house to make an investigation after the report of their disappearance and shook the bed covers and picked up a lady's pocketbook, presumably Mrs. Lee's, and examined it, and we found it on the bed. There was no evidence of a struggle, except that when we went in there, the vacuum cleaner was on the west side of the bed, partly under the bed, and showing evidence that it could have been hastily put there or left there. On Saturday morning early, I was informed of a call by the sheriff's office to the effect that Gettis Lee had been found. I went to Parrish and to the scene. The sheriff and quite a crowd had gathered. I looked in the ditch and immediately saw that it was a woman, lying face down with her head submerged. All of her clothes, except her brassiere, was pulled up round her neck. Her red shoes were on and sticking out of the water. And on her back, in view, was a wound approximately 4 inches in length, which could easily be seen from the bank down to where she was in the water. That part of her back from her mid-shoulders back was slightly out of the water. The road, which was approximately 8 feet off the ditch bank, was of sandy marl type. A place on the south side of the road nearest the ditch in which we found the body was an embankment which had been thrown up by a grader and which had been used at that time to level the road. There was blood stains on the north side of this little throw-up or embankment leading out into the road, probably 2 feet. There was a depression at that particular spot, apparently caused by something being dragged there or standing there, or by some means. It appeared that the body had been dragged across this little embankment thrown up by the grader, and there was some blood stains on the grass as if the body had been dragged from the edge of the road to that ditch. A rain which had been of sufficient amount to actually run on and wash and level the roadway had occurred from the time the body was dragged and placed in the ditch and the time she bled there. There evidently was quite a bit of bleeding at the scene, because at the depth of 1 or 2 or 3 inches in the sand there was considerably more blood than appeared at the surface. The only other thing found at the scene was a pair of glasses that were right on the edge of the weeds near the side of the road where the body had apparently been dragged. There was a dollar bill lying between the ditch and the road in the weeds and grass, which at that time were probably 3 to 6 inches high. Another dollar bill was found approximately 50 feet further east down the road, between the south side of the road and the ditch. On this same ridge, at a distance of approximately 50 to 75 yards to the west, and traveling from west toward the scene, the tracks of a man running who had a rather large foot. A little to the west was a piece of cloth in the road which we judged to be material tied to the end of some protruding object from a truck or automobile. This cloth did not match any material of the clothes worn by the deceased or Mr. Gettis Lee. After Mrs. Lee's clothes were removed, the body and the head wounds were apparent. There was one wound that entered approximately 2 inches to the rear of the left ear, at the level about midway of the ear. X-rays were made to determine whether bullets or fragments thereof were left in the body. Slight fragments appeared around the wound in the back of the head. The fragments were lead as contrasted to copper jacket or copper coating. Another bullet entered the neck on the left side, slightly toward the front and the side center of the neck, and went out slightly to the back of the right center of the neck. Another entered her left breast and came out the right shoulder. The wound on the back was unusual for the reason that, apparently, one side was smooth cut and the other side was rough-edged, at intervals as uniform as saw teeth for about 4 inches in width. After she was removed to the undertaker's, one of the attendants there discovered a wound underneath the right knee which, after examination by Dr. White, was determined to be another bullet wound, which entered by the left side and exited from the right side. Since this is largely for you, Mr. Williams, I'm not going to relate what the Roberts related to me about the first discovery, about the Lees being missing after they were called by the attendants at the store. I understood from my conversation with them that the light in the living room was on when they went around there, the TV set was turned off, the door from the kitchen into the garage was slightly ajar, and the light inside of the garage was turned on. We looked completely through the house and the garage for any sign of a struggle, for bullet holes, and could not find anything. The deceased's wedding ring, engagement ring, and watch were in a small box in the top drawer of a chest of drawers by her bed. On a later occasion, Deputy Gill and I did find tracks of both a man and a woman that went through the grove to a road. This was not a public road, but went into the grove for loading and unloading and led out to a side road. It appeared that a car had turned around down there. All these signs had been affected by the rain just as the ones at the scene had. There were tracks probably 10 to 15 feet into the edge of a grove immediately adjacent to the entrance of the garage. A limb or two had been pruned off of a citrus tree there. My information disclosed that Mrs. Lee during that day or the day before had been doing a little pruning around the house. There were tracks from that place out toward the highway which ran in front of the Lee's home. They likewise were clearly affected by the rain. From our information, Mrs. Lee was seen shortly before noon the day of her disappearance. Mrs. Meade Britt saw her earlier in the day. The minister and his wife called on her, but we have not been able to find anyone who saw Mrs. Lee in the afternoon of the day. No one noticed or heard any disturbance over at the house or anywhere in the vicinity that night, but all explained that it was a cold, rainy, windy night. We know that Mr. Lee went to Eunice Snyder's home after picking up the boxed lunches, and they ate supper, and that he evidently left shortly after 9 o'clock, because he was seen turning on the Brannan-Gainey corner at Manatee Avenue and 100th Street in the neighborhood of 9:10 or 9:15 p.m. I am unable to establish that he was seen after that time. Eunice Snyder is a young lady who, at the time of Mr. Lee's disappearance and Mrs. Lee's death, was an employee at the First National Bank of Bradenton as a bookkeeper. It appears that she and another girl named Martha, from 1949 to 1950, lived in Bradenton and roomed together at what was then known as the Arcade Hotel. It appears that Lee was going with Martha, and that thereafter, approximately in 1950, these two girls moved to Tampa, where they continued to live together, and Lee continued going with Martha. However, Martha was going with another man who was apparently of good reputation, and married him, thereby breaking up the romance with Mr. Lee. It appears there was quite a little bit of feeling between the girls at that time, because one felt that the other had moved out and left her with the bills and such that were not fair. Lee then started going with Eunice, who was then working at one of the grocery stores in Tampa. He wanted her to move back to Bradenton. He contacted the Bank of Palmetto and wanted them to employ her, and they did not have an opening at the time, and it appears that Mr. Lee let his account, which he carried at the bank, become depleted. He did succeed in getting Eunice a position at the First National Bank. He owned this lot where she is now living, and evidently built the house which she is now occupying for her. He took a mortgage for $4,000 from her on this home, but he had his attorney, W.J. Ray, prepare a satisfaction of that mortgage, which was duly executed in 1953. Over the last 2 or 3 years, he had delivered a package to at least 3 employees in the store, with directions that if anything should happen to him, that package should be delivered to Eunice Snyder. All 3 of them knew her. On Monday afternoon, the family went in the store and, as I understand it, talked rather severely to Mr. Durrance and told him he was withholding evidence, whereupon he delivered the package to them, and they took it, and he understood that they, the members of Mr. Lee's family, took it back to their home. My information from Mr. Durrance is that they later returned the package and it had been opened. I looked at the contents of the package, and it contained the mortgage, the insurance papers on the house of Eunice Snyder, and the satisfaction of mortgage, and a picture of Eunice Snyder. I am informed that Durrance later delivered this package to her, but in just this connection I will say now that Durrance informed me that immediately after Eunice Snyder was informed of the disappearance of Lee, and previous to the finding of Mrs. Lee's body, Eunice Snyder called him and asked him if he had this package, directing him to keep it and stating that she might need him. He was unable to explain to me what she meant by that statement. He knew that Mr. Lee had been carrying groceries to her, and that he had fixed meat for him to take to her, and that he had met her in the store, and that she, in the company of her father, had spent the day with Lee on his ranch. In other words, it was well known in Parrish and to Lee's family, and to many people in Bradenton who had on many occasions seen them, that they were in each other's company at frequent intervals. So naturally, one of the first persons that we turned to for further knowledge of facts pertaining to the death of Mrs. Lee and the disappearance of Mr. Lee was Eunice Snyder. She confirmed the fact that he had given her the home, that she knew of the existence of the satisfaction of mortgage, that she saw him on this night and that he left a little early, and that she knew he had his money and his gun with him when he was at the house, and that the reason she knew of the time of his leaving was that they watched a TV show which was over at 9 o'clock. She believed him to be 53 years old instead of 63. He had told her that. They had maybe petty little misunderstandings, but nothing serious, and that she was in love with him and would not step out on him, and she did not believe that he would step out on her. She said they did not have any plans to marry, no plans to leave, and that she could not be of any further help to us. She had seen Mrs. Lee, but did not ever recall having talked with her or spoken to her, and said she had no knowledge of any trouble between Gettis Lee and Mrs. Lee with reference to her. Miss Snyder has been cooperative with us to this date.
About a week after Mrs. Lee's body turned up, Smiley got a call from a man named Will Gilly, who explained that he had been negotiating with Gettis Lee to sell off his share and the shares of the other heirs in their family estate. Everybody was agreeable to sell, except his brother, Frank Gilly. Frank wouldn't sell. Gettis had agreed to pay each heir $1,000. On the Thursday that Gettis disappeared, Will Gilly had supposedly agreed to come to Parrish on Friday morning to meet with the lawyer and see if they could come up with a plan. Problem was, Frank owned the land next to the family property, couldn't afford to buy everybody else out, and he was sore about the whole business. While Smiley and Deputy Gill were out there sifting bloody sand for murder souvenirs that Sunday, Frank had allegedly run into Will and lit into him like a man trying to win an argument with whiskey.
"You didn't get to sell that place to Gettis, did you?"
He snarled. Will admitted that he didn't know whether his brother Frank could have done something to the Lees, but since he was both State Attorney Smiley's client and friend, he figured he should mention it. In small Florida towns, gossip traveled faster than moonshine and often with worse outcomes. People had plenty to say about Gettis Lee. One of Smiley's sources was Horace Walker, a man that Smiley described as being, quote, on the wrong side of things ever since I've known him. Nevertheless, Smiley shared with the FSB agents that Horace claimed, a couple weeks before the killings, he had been in Lee's store when Gettis reached under the counter and showed him a photograph of his girlfriend. According to Horace, Gettis said she'd been his girl for a long time, and he intended to stick with her, although his wife Merrill was kicking up about it. Apparently Merrill knew about Gettis's old flame Maud. She was in the past, or so she thought. She didn't know that Maudie, as some called her, had reached out to Gettis recently, hoping to do some reacquainting. Gettis didn't bite. But this other girl, Eunice, she was another matter entirely. That one, Horace said, had caused some commotion at home. And locals started tossing out suspects the way a drunk poker player throws chips at a bad hand. From Parrish to Tampa, law enforcement was being fed names to any trooper or deputy they could get to listen. Earl Crenshaw looked promising for about 10 minutes. Highway Patrol picked him up 2 days after the Lees disappeared, carrying a .38 revolver, matching the general description of the weapon they assumed killed Merrill Lee, along with a fat wad of cash. The FBI tested the gun and found it didn't match the bullet. And that wad of cash? Well, old Earl's wife had recently died, and that money was the insurance payout. Another suspect out of Tampa got fingered by a local resident that investigators delicately described as a half-wit. Statements by the alleged half-wit were refuted by their investigation. Luther Langford, at least he made sense, former Gettis Lee store butcher, drew suspicion because he'd gotten angry about being fired over letting a bunch of meat spoil. Murder by resentment and rotting beef was briefly entertained until he passed a polygraph. After that, the suspect list started reading like names pulled from a church raffle. Ex-girlfriends, drinking buddies, neighbors, busybodies, citizens with overactive imaginations, all nominated somebody who ought to be looked at. By then, the investigation had less in common with police work and more in common with community theater. Everybody got a shot at playing the villain. And that was pretty much the show. That ragtag parade of suspects made up virtually the entire focus of the first 6 months of the investigation. The funny thing is, none of them fit a scenario where Merrill Lee herself had been the intended target. Gettis Lee? Sure. Depending on who was talking, the man had business disputes, romantic complications, grudges, and enough gossip swirling around him to stock 3 beauty parlors and a bait shop. But Merrill? By all accounts, she kept to herself. She minded her business and never gave anyone reason to hate her enough to shoot her multiple times and dump her in a ditch on lonely Erie Road at night wearing her red moccasins. There had to be at least 2 killers. Everyone agreed on that. One to drive the car seen on Erie Road, another to dump Gettis Lee's abandoned vehicle where it ultimately surfaced. But maybe not 2 men. Max Smiley casually slipped one little detail into his testimony like a pickpocket lifting a wallet at a church social. One of the sets of footprints outside the Lee home appeared to belong to a woman, at least according to State Attorney Smiley. 1 killer commits murder. 2 killers stage a disappearance. But throw a woman into the mix, and you've got yourself a headline. State Attorney Smiley was the only person who mentioned seeing female footprints around the scene. However, that detail also made it into a master detective story that was featured in a 1961 article. The article was clearly written by someone who had gotten some documentation on the case or had cooperation with investigators. But if there were prints from a man and a woman in that citrus grove near the Lee house, does that mean that one of the perpetrators was a woman? What if the alleged female prints were Merrill Lee's? The master detective story said that the prints were from a high-heeled shoe, but Merrill Lee was found wearing red moccasins, which is interesting because if she was roused from the couch where she had been watching TV when her husband arrived home that night, she didn't stand up and put on her house shoes to walk over and greet him. Those were still sitting in front of the Davenport the next morning. Nettie Roberts, Gettis Lee's sister, also said that the TV was off when she arrived that morning. And since she was the first person to arrive at the scene and enter the house, if that is correct, then it doesn't sound like Merrill Lee was watching TV before she was intercepted by the perpetrator or perpetrators. Was Merrill Lee walked at gunpoint to a waiting vehicle in the groves with one of the perpetrators before her husband arrived home? Not if they were high heels, they weren't. But what if the detective magazine just fluffed that detail up a bit for effect, as they had many other details? Picture a gorgeous dame in red high heels walking through the citrus groves at night. Maybe a thin cigarette dangling from her mouth as she quietly motions to her conspirator, directing him with a red lacquered fingernail that glistens beneath the moonlight. That's what they want you to picture, right? When you read those rags. Maybe the perpetrator pulled right into the garage and grabbed her when she flipped on the garage light and stepped out to greet him, thinking it was her husband arriving home. We don't know if Gettis Lee ever pulled into that driveway because nobody matched any tracks to his tires. The point is that the timeline and details, or lack thereof, leave the door cracked open just enough for a few theories to slip through wearing soft shoes and bad intentions. The partially opened door, the tire tracks in the garage, footprints in the orange groves. Neighbors heard nothing. What if Merrill Lee was already gone before Gettis ever made it home that night? Maybe she was taken first, while one of the bad guys stayed behind in the dark, waiting for Gettis Lee to come home. Once the Florida Sheriff's Bureau finished squeezing whatever they could out of State Attorney Smiley, heir apparent to the Lee investigation, and collected the crumbs that Sheriff Bodden and his deputies called police work, it was time to start talking to witnesses on their own. Naturally, they started with Donald Durrance because if there was anybody who knew the rhythms of Gettis Lee's life, it was the man who spent half of his waking hours every day in his store listening to gossip over the hum of the Coca-Cola cooler. Durrance walked them through March 7th from the moment that he arrived at the store, and then investigators pivoted toward the more interesting question. Who exactly was Gettis Lee when nobody was looking? Durrance explained that Gettis Lee owned around 100 heads of cattle, and he checked on them every morning around 9, except Saturdays. A little bit more of that routine showing through. Beyond that, he made money from his orange groves every year and the grocery business. Then, Durrance casually mentioned a detail that investigators probably circled 3 times in red pen. Not long before Lee vanished, Horace Walker, a known Sarasota Bolita figure, had stopped by to see him. Durrance had no idea what they discussed. FSB investigators pressed Durrance about Sheriff Roy Bodden, which is our first indication that they, too, looked at his handling of the investigation and wondered if something was off. Durrance said that he had never actually seen Bodden hanging around Lee's store, but Gettis Lee had talked about him often during the last election because he had openly supported the sheriff. As to whether Gettis Lee was mixed up in Bolita or moonshine, Durrance said not to his knowledge. The next stop for investigators was William J. Ray, Gettis Lee's personal attorney of many years. The courts couldn't settle the estate until Gettis's body turned up, or 7 years passed, and they could legally declare him dead. In the meantime, some had developed a theory that Gettis Lee had murdered Merrill Lee and skipped town to spend his golden years chasing women elsewhere. The legal problem was determining which Lee died first, because that would decide which side of the family inherited the estate. Nothing spices up a murder investigation quite like probate law. The judge ruled, temporarily, that Gettis Lee's mother, Elizabeth Lee, would manage affairs, the store, the ranch, the groves, while everybody else sat tight and waited for Gettis Lee or his body to turn up. As for assets, William Ray said that Lee had $50,000 to $60,000 in cash, a checking account at the Manatee River National Bank in Bradenton that contained $6,000, an account at First National Bank in Bradenton where he had $27,000, and a third account in Auburndale that contained $6,000. Just so you have a general sense of Gettis Lee's position in the pecking order of Parrish and its approximately 600 residents at the time, those assets added together in 1957 is roughly equivalent in purchasing power to about $1,090,300 today. Gettis had transferred all his real property from his name only to both he and Merrill's name in 1956, and didn't give his lawyer at the time a reason. He simply requested the change. A traveling salesman was the next person that they interviewed. Lawrence Keller had heard at Whidden's grocery that Gettis hadn't shown up for work the morning after the disappearance. A couple hours later, the salesman was in the vicinity making his rounds and he spotted Gettis Lee's car in front of the old Groover store building. Keller, who knew Gettis Lee, recalled him discussing his personal life in surprising detail. He said that Gettis Lee had told him once that a doctor warned him that he and Merrill Lee shouldn't live together as husband and wife because of her illness. Keller also remembered Lee eyeing Barbara Tyson, his dead best friend's niece, and remarking,
Boy, I'd like to get some of that.
with all of the elegance of a truck stop whistle. Lee had also told the salesman he wasn't the only man in town with girlfriends. Sheriff Roy Bodden had his share, too. That little nugget probably landed in the investigators' notebooks with the subtlety of a hand grenade. Then there was the story about Smacks in Sarasota, one of those drive-in restaurants where you ordered through the speaker and a gal brought you your food out to your car on a tray that you would hook over your car door. Everyone who had heard the story or experienced it told a slightly different version. According to the salesman, Lee had gotten into a near brawl while out with one of his girlfriends, and the ladies broke up the fight before fists flew. Horace Walker elaborated on the drive-in story. Walker said that Gettis Lee caught Maud Rawls at the Smacks drive-in with another man and beat her up right there in public. Gettis had told him that they had broken up because Maud kept pushing him to marry her. Walker described Gettis Lee as, quote,
tight as the bark on an oak tree after a good rain.
Except when it came to women. Another time Walker was in the store, Gettis pulled out his favorite prop, that picture of Eunice, and he said that he didn't have to go to Tampa anymore to see her. He got her a job in Bradenton at the bank, and he bought her a house and a car. Walker told investigators the story that Gettis Lee had told him about the time that Eunice's father almost caught Gettis with his pants down. Eunice had stalled in the living room while Lee scrambled to dress himself. Walker believed that Gettis Lee was seriously considering divorce, but he never outright said so. He suspected that Eunice may have been pushing for marriage and that Gettis Lee felt cornered.
Gettis Lee is or was the kind of man that would get anything he wanted, one way or the other.
Walker told investigators that about 4 or 5 months before the disappearance, Gettis Lee had a falling out with Sheriff Bodden and Max Smiley over weekly payoff money that Gettis Lee had supposedly been giving one of Bodden's deputies. According to him, Lee decided the payoff got too expensive and he refused to keep paying. Now that sounds like it sidled up a little closer to motive than anything had to date, if true. But could these alleged payoffs ever be proven? And what was Gettis Lee paying for, allegedly? Walker claimed he didn't know what the money was for, but he insisted that Gettis Lee was not involved in Bolita or moonshine. Investigators made a careful note that the payoff story came not from Walker himself, but from an unnamed informant that he refused to identify. Naturally. The next FSB interview was with a confidential informant, and of course it would be, on the heels of Horace Walker's earlier grenade about Gettis Lee, State Attorney Smiley, and Sheriff Roy Bodden, and some mysterious payoff arrangement floating around Manatee County like cigarette smoke in a pool hall. According to the source, T.L. Brown, and that's a name you're going to want to remember, a bird dog trainer out of Parrish, and apparently part-time political visionary, approached him back in 1952 before the election and had confidently announced that he intended to run the Bolita racket in Manatee County after. Nothing shows civic ambition quite like planning organized gambling operations before the ballots are even counted. T.L. Brown allegedly offered the informant $100 to $200 a week to act as a pickup man. The informant responded with the obvious point.
T.L. Roy Bodden can't take the Bolita away from the other men and give it to you.
Other men, implying that there was already active Bolita activity happening and Sheriff Roy Bodden was mixed up in it. T.L. Brown assured the man that everything would work out just fine if he got on board. Then, according to the source, Brown never mentioned it again. But afterward he became openly hostile toward Bodden, calling him a crook and a thief every chance he got. The next interview was Reverend Wayne Stutzman, minister at Parish Methodist Church, where Merrill Lee attended. Gettis, however, apparently skipped church entirely. The Reverend and his wife Doris happened to stop by the Lee home on the day that she disappeared for a friendly visit around 11 a.m. They chatted with Merrill for about an hour. No religion, no confessions, just small talk. He had not met the woman, and it had been on his to-do list, apparently. Merrill worried aloud to the Reverend that her husband was working too hard. Trouble with grove laborers meant Gettis had been forced to do much of the work himself. The meeting with the Reverend was one of the last ordinary conversations that anyone would have with Merrill Lee. No ominous music, no warnings, just concern over oranges and labor problems. That's the thing about tragedy. It almost always arrives in the middle of a painfully normal day. Next, the investigators interviewed Moselle Hunter, a black woman who had known Gettis Lee for years and occasionally worked odd jobs for him. Interestingly, she also did ironing and housekeeping for his girlfriend, Eunice Snyder. Apparently, the late Mason Tyson may he rest in peace, Gettis's friend, had recommended her for the job. I think this tells you how close that Tyson and Lee were, if Tyson is recommending help for his mistress. When speaking about Merrill Lee, Moselle's tone softened. She was one of the best persons I ever knew. And one thing Moselle wanted to make perfectly clear to investigators was that her people would never hurt Mr. or Mrs. Lee. In fact, Gettis often extended credit to struggling black families who needed groceries. When investigators brought up Belita, Moselle mentioned that she occasionally played the numbers herself and that Gettis sometimes loaned her money to do it. He would later ask her if her number hit. But according to her, Lee was not involved in gambling or moonshine. He didn't like whiskey, she said. He would run a man out of the store if he came in drinking. The feds, those cheerful little rain clouds in government-issued suits, decided to spend some time retracing the routes that Gettis Lee could have driven on the night of March 7, 1957. From Gettis Lee's store in Parrish to Betty's Lunch, where he picked up the boxed dinners in Bradenton, was 14.2 miles. A 25-minute drive if you followed the speed limit. From Betty's Lunch to Eunice Snyder's place was another 3 miles or 11 minutes. Then on toward Manatee Avenue and 10th, where the two women collecting newspaper fees spotted Gettis behind the wheel, waving like the mayor in a parade, blissfully unaware the universe had unsavory plans for him within the next hour. Investigators figured Gettis would have gotten home just after 9:30 that night. Nobody figured he got there any earlier. And that was the problem, because the train conductor placed the car that almost certainly carried Merrill Lee to her doom on Erie Road at 9:25 sharp, which meant somebody either moved fast, got lucky, or Merrill was lured out of the house before her husband even made it home. There's no proof of that, just the kind of possibility that keeps cops going through 2-packs before lunch. The next leg of the investigation turned in the direction of the woman orbiting Gettis Lee. Virginia Amos told them that she had seen Gettis Lee earlier that day near the First National Bank in downtown Bradenton. He stopped to chat. He asked her how she'd been getting along since her husband died. Later that night around 7, Virginia Amos picked up her friend Laura Parrish. The two women made the rounds collecting newspaper fees. Somewhere around 9, they spotted Gettis Lee. She had also heard that the Lees no longer had a sexual relationship because Merrill had undergone a hysterectomy years earlier. Then, Mrs. Amos added, helpfully, and with the confidence of someone oversharing at a funeral, that she had had the same surgery, but it hadn't affected her enjoyment of marital relations in the least. Next came Laura Parrish, and if the agents thought things couldn't get more uncomfortable, they clearly hadn't met Florida people before. Laura Parrish admitted that she had slept with Gettis sometime around 1948, while married. According to Mrs. Parrish, he flattered her until she, quote, didn't know what was happening, and before she knew it, the whole affair was over. Mrs. Parrish later became convinced that her daughter's diabetes was divine punishment for her affair. Next in the lineup of girlfriends past was Mrs. Maud Danofsky, formerly Maud Rawls. Maud dated Gettis back in 1940 when she drove a school bus for Manatee County. Maud said that Gettis Lee had a temper. He was the jealous type, and he always carried a folded wad of cash in his shirt pocket, and he packed a gun everywhere he went. Then she gave her version of the Smack's drive-in restaurant story. After they had broken up, she had run into Gettis at Smack's with another woman. Since Gettis had told her after their breakup that he couldn't live without her, Maud sauntered up to his car to make it known that she could see him, apparently getting along quite well without her. Gettis told her that this was his first date with this woman. Maud said she got mad, so she smacked him in the head. He got out of the car and words were exchanged. Words like, "You're a son of a bitch." Maud didn't see Gettis Lee again until around 1949. Her mother died and Gettis attended the funeral. In 1950, at the funeral of Mrs. Durrance, Gettis Lee asked to take her home. Maud accepted. What that tells us is that his wife Merrill wasn't at that funeral with him. During the ride home, Gettis tried to get her back, offering Maud a house and to pay all her expenses. He told her he would keep the deeds in her name, unrecorded, in his safe until his death. Maud declined. And then there were three. Martha Reeder, formerly Martha Bethea, was the next woman in Gettis Lee's orbit that investigators sat down with. Martha said that when she and Gettis began dating, he threw his money around freely. He bought her dinners, helped her get a car, and let her charge clothing on his account. Martha said that while she and Eunice Snyder were rooming together in Bradenton, Eunice was going with a married man who operated a filling station near Ellenton, which Martha described as a broken-down shack. The man was crazy about Eunice, and Martha thought that he later divorced his wife because of their relationship. It was that relationship, in fact, according to Martha, that resulted in the two women being asked to move out of the apartment building. Eunice and Martha then moved to Tampa, and both got jobs at B&B Supermarket around 1950. They rented a room together, but were eventually asked to leave there as well. Martha said that the landlady caught Eunice in the apartment with a man. During one visit that Martha and Eunice had made to Gettis Lee's store together, he and Martha ducked out and left Eunice back at the store while they drove to his farm, for reasons both obvious and entirely unsuitable for Sunday church discussion. Martha eventually realized that she was headed toward becoming a permanent side dish in Gettis Lee's all-you-can-eat buffet of romance, so she chose marriage. Almost immediately, Gettis shifted his attention to Eunice Snyder, although Martha suspected that they had been sneaking around together before her own affair officially ended. Martha described Gettis as intensely jealous, constantly checking up on her, appearing unexpectedly, and phoning her house to make sure she was where she claimed to be. Martha admitted to investigators that she had met Gettis in a parking lot a few weeks before he disappeared. She called him, she said, because she wanted his advice. She was contemplating divorce. Gettis told her he would think about it, and he would contact her later. That was the last time she saw him. The investigator asked,
Were you aware of any depressed, mental problems that Eunice Snyder may have experienced as a result of her sexual activities with Gettis Lee?
Martha said, Eunice was strange. She got the impression that Eunice would only tell you what she wanted you to know. She said that when the two of them worked at B&B Supermarket, Eunice may have been involved with the married assistant manager, Mr. J.A. Lee, no relation to Gettis, and that had resulted in some marital problems. Investigators tracked down the former assistant manager, now manager, of B&B Supermarket to follow up. He described both women as, quote, pretty fast. When asked if he had had an affair with Eunice that damaged his marriage, he seemed to somehow confirm the gossip, blaming the whole thing on his wife being jealous after seeing Eunice Snyder smile at him in the store one day. That must have been one hell of a smile. Rain had a bad habit of sticking to Bradenton like bad gossip. In 1949, it rolled in right alongside Eunice Snyder and her father, William T. Snyder. Eunice was 19 years old with blue eyes and dark hair, carrying enough family baggage on her 5'5.5" frame to fill a Greyhound bus, with room left over for disappointment. For starters, it doesn't appear that she had much of a relationship with her mother. Her parents lived apart but were never divorced. Eunice's sister Ava, 8 years older than her, had lived in a state mental hospital for years. Second grade was the highest level of schooling that she had completed. It was one of those awful, massive custodial institutions that were overcrowded, and residents recalled horrors like the use of straitjackets and being lined up and showered with fire hoses. Mr. Snyder's 1942 draft card listed Eunice Snyder as the person who will always know your address. She was 12 years old at the time. Eunice told investigators that she finished high school, but the local paper back in New York, in the summer of 47, listed her among a group of Leavenworth Central School students that had been announced for the 1948 yearbook staff. That should have been her senior year, but she doesn't show up in school records the following year. Her younger brother, William, attended that same school throughout graduation in 1953, so a change in schools in the interim seems unlikely. Between 1947 and 55, Mr. Snyder had put different help wanted ads in the Rochester and Syracuse newspapers, all listing his address as Butler, New York. In the summer of 49, it was, quote, motherless home of two. Eunice was in Florida by the end of that year. By 1955, the ads requested an elderly lady desiring a home for father and son only. During the ensuing years, her father was back and forth from up north, while Eunice lived in Bradenton. He didn't seem real stable as far as employment. All of this to say, Eunice had the kind of family backstory that made cops nod slowly while lighting cigarettes that they'd already forgot they were smoking. At 19, she must have had a reason to want to be as far as you could get from home. Florida has a way of doing that, beckoning the dreamers, the troubled, people in desperate need of a change of scenery. When she first arrived, Eunice ended up at the Moore Apartments, where she met Martha Bethea, and through Martha she met Gettis Lee. At that time, Gettis Lee was 57 years old. Eunice was 20. In 1955, back in Butler, New York, Eunice's 20-year-old brother, William Jr., was involved in a crash that killed his 27-year-old passenger, Corporal Roy Davey, who was out on leave from the Air Force. Unfortunately, it's unclear at what point in the timeline that Junior Snyder tried his hand in Gettis Lee's orange groves before being relieved of his duties for not being able to live up to his employer's expectations. And how close to the disappearance of the Lees did this employment occur? There was another interesting incident that occurred in May of 56, about a year before the Lees were killed, and also right around the time that Gettis Lee was changing all the paperwork in his portfolio from just him to him and Merrill. Eunice walked out of work one day at the bank, and her 1952 light green Chevy was missing from the spot where she had parked it. Witnesses saw a wrecker pull up and remove it that afternoon around 11 a.m. The incident actually made the paper. The next day, the paper reported that the mystery was solved, and it was the police who had the vehicle towed, but allegedly, they had been looking for a 1949 Chevy that had been parked there for at least a week. They say that they grabbed the wrong Chevy, but the kicker was that the alleged 1949 Chevy that had already been there a week suddenly just disappeared, according to police. It's hard to say whether this was purely a coincidence or some sort of targeted harassment. What we do know is that Gettis had purchased the 1952 Chevy for her, put it in her name, and then retained the mortgage, just like her house. Gettis Lee controlled the strings of Eunice Snyder's life. According to Eunice, the night Gettis disappeared started plain enough. Around 7:30 or so, he rolled up with chicken dinner still warm in the bag. He sat down with Eunice and her father, and the three of them ate dinner together like some deeply uncomfortable Norman Rockwell painting. Then they watched television until 9. The program ended, and apparently so did Gettis's interest in hanging around, while her father played chaperone, perhaps with the enthusiasm of a prison guard. Eunice walked him out to the car and reminded him, according to her, to check whether his money was still inside. According to Eunice, Gettis was in high spirits that night. Understanding, even, she said, which was impressive considering he was a 62-year-old man courting a much younger woman, while her father, who was only a few years younger than him, sat 6 feet away, chewing his chicken and silently reconsidering every life decision that had led the three of them there. Somehow the FBI had learned that Eunice visited a doctor in Tampa regarding, quote, sexual and emotional problems. How they learned this remains a mystery, but this was during J. Edgar Hoover's reign, when the feds were about as constrained as a gunslinger in the Wild West. When agents asked her about it, Eunice admitted that she had seen a doctor, but she refused to elaborate. The FBI agents described her as hostile and uncooperative during the early interviews, which frankly feels like a reasonable response when a room full of federal agents start asking you about your sex life. By June, though, she became more cooperative. The FBI and State Attorney Smiley wanted her to take a polygraph. Eunice stalled until she spoke privately with Sheriff Roy Bodden. Somehow, after talking to Bodden, she agreed. Naturally, tongues started wagging. Why did Eunice Snyder need to talk to Sheriff Bodden first? What exactly was their relationship? The first polygraph showed no guilty knowledge, but later, opinions changed. Polygraphs, after all, are like horoscopes for men with badges. Everybody believes them until they don't. Eunice admitted that she knew all about the signed mortgage satisfaction documents that Gettis had arranged. He had already bought her a 1952 Chevrolet under the same agreement as her house, with the satisfaction of that vehicle left with the Chevy company and instructions for it to be delivered to her in the event of Gettis Lee's death. In August of 1956, she upgraded to a brand new 1956 Chevrolet Sports Coupe, paid entirely in cash. Eunice confirmed that Lee and Bodden had once been extremely close, so close, in fact, that Gettis personally introduced them and told Eunice to go to Bodden for help anytime she needed it. But in the weeks leading up to when he disappeared, even Eunice admitted that Gettis Lee and Sheriff Bodden were not getting along anymore. Why? She claimed she didn't know, and she admitted that she hoped to marry him someday, although she claimed that they had never seriously discussed it. At this point in the interview, Eunice offered a story out of the blue, an old incident involving Martha and a 1950 Ford that Gettis Lee had bought her. She said it broke down, and Martha took it to a garage in Tampa. Just to show you how friendly Martha was, Eunice said helpfully. She met a man at the garage that she liked, and she agreed to allow him to take her to a show. I went along too, and Gettis Lee caught us. He got real mad. Eunice also offered her opinion of Martha's husband, Lamar Reeder. I liked Lamar Reeder. He was a very nice boy. I just don't think that he got what he deserved when he married Martha. She's just not good enough for him. Delivered like a woman buttering toast. Eunice Snyder was contacted in February of '58 and asked to take a polygraph, but her father was picked up first. He claimed that this was his first interaction with the sheriff's department, although the FBI had already interviewed him back in Butler, New York, after Merrill Lee's murder. Which tells us that despite having been staying with his daughter for months prior to the Lee homicides, he left Florida afterward. How soon after the murder had he skipped town, you ask? Well, that's a good question. The records don't say. Naturally. When he was first asked to take the polygraph, Mr. Snyder got belligerent and declared that the tests were unreliable. Eventually he agreed, but only if the test would happen at home, his daughter Eunice's home, where he was again staying when they approached him. So on February 12, 1958, about a year after the homicides, Lieutenant Donaldson lugged his polygraph equipment over to 777 38th Street in Bradenton like a traveling vacuum cleaner salesman of human anxiety. Now, Eunice took her polygraph the same day, but not at the house like her dad. Instead, they conducted hers at the Shoreline Motel in Bradenton 2 hours later. Why? Maybe somebody liked motel coffee. Maybe she needed a break from her dad. Maybe everybody in this investigation just enjoyed making things unnecessarily suspicious. Donaldson initially concluded that Eunice answered truthfully, but something must have been weighing on him because the next day he changed his mind. Slightly. He revised the charts and announced that Eunice had some kind of cyclical cardio pattern that masked deception responses. Her psychological responses may have hidden deception on 3 key questions. 1. Had she dated Roy Bodden? 2. Had she slept with Roy Bodden? And 3. Did Gettis Lee receive a phone call at her house the night of March 7th? When she was asked about Merrill Lee, she said she never met the woman, but she had seen her, although they didn't press her on what occasion that had been. Did she happen upon her in Bradenton? That's unlikely. Merrill Lee didn't travel to Bradenton very often without her husband, if ever. Or was Eunice trying to see what the woman looked like? Trying to see what the woman who was living the life that she wanted looked like? Maybe driving by her home, catching sight of her puttering in her garden. Yet despite hours of interviews, countless questions, and enough cigarette smoke to cloud the Gulf Coast, one thing stood out. Not once did Eunice Snyder describe Gettis Lee as kind or loving or gentle. In fact, she didn't utter a single positive word about the man. By the end of it all, Eunice painted Gettis Lee as jealous, suspicious, quick-tempered, and forever watchful. A man who called constantly, stopped by unexpectedly, and checked on her whenever paranoia got the better of him. The next stop on the grand tour of bad decisions and buried secrets was Red Purvis, proprietor of Red's Pure Oil Station, the kind of roadside grease palace where the coffee tasted like axle fluid and everybody knew everybody else's sins by first name. Red talked about Eunice Snyder like a man remembering a favorite cigarette brand that had been discontinued by the government. Eunice kept the books and helped around the station, but eventually he had to fire her. Not because she couldn't do the job, but because Mrs. Purvis had developed the entirely unreasonable suspicion that a reasonably attractive woman working around her husband all day might lead to trouble. Red denied any romance between himself and Eunice with the enthusiasm of a man trying not to sleep on the couch for the rest of his natural life. Red also knew Eunice's father because he had hired him once or twice for carpentry work. He said that on the day that Eunice got canned, old man Snyder was right there at his station, hammering away at repairs, while Red awkwardly explained that if he wanted to stay married, Eunice would have to go. Perhaps most interestingly, according to Red, Mr. Snyder was, quote, foolish when it came to his daughter. Whatever that meant, because investigators didn't actually ask. It's so much more fun when we can just fill in the blanks, like an investigation via Mad Libs. Red felt that Mr. Snyder was, quote, that way about his daughter because she'd lived with him more or less since her parents split years before, meaning basically she had been motherless, but again, no clarity on what that way meant. Then Red Purvis leaned in and shared another observation.
He was quite a man. I bet he could choke a bear with his bare hands.
Red said that he wouldn't want to run into Mr. Snyder when he was angry. He felt that he would be dangerous. He also mentioned that 3 months before Gettis Lee vanished into the swampy twilight, Mr. Snyder stopped by the station and mentioned that he had been doing some work for Gettis Lee. Red said he wasn't aware of any bad blood between the men. Then they started talking about money. Red said that Eunice told him Gettis had loaned her cash to build her house, and that she was paying 7% interest on the loan. A tiny little detail that Eunice somehow forgot to mention to investigators. Red also mentioned that another station hand, Lester Dean, refused Eunice Snyder when she came around asking for money to make additions to her home. In January of 1957, just a couple months before Gettis Lee and his wife disappeared, she got another permit, this time to add an extension to her home. The fact that she was asking other men for money, besides Gettis Lee, seems important. Red suspected that Dean had tried to romance Eunice and failed. So investigators moved on to the next rumor. There were more women. Obviously. Helen Phillips explained that while her husband was out of town, she had stopped by Lee's store to use the phone one day, and Gettis made a pass at her, casually mentioning that he knew her husband was out of town. On the day that Gettis Lee disappeared, Mrs. Phillips said she was at the store and she overheard him talking on the phone with a woman.
I can't make it tonight, but I'll see you Saturday.
And then, after listening a moment, he replied,
Well, you can put him to bed.
With 24-year-old Marjorie Huggins, investigators walked in swinging and immediately asked whether Gettis Lee had fathered her 7-month-old baby. Subtle bunch, these guys. Marjorie denied it. However, she did say 10 months earlier, during her pregnancy, Gettis had offered to buy her a car if she'd sleep with him regularly. She declined. The investigators interviewed Johnny Gaskins McClamrock, who knew Gettis from back during the war. One time, while teaching her to drive, he got particularly handsy, and she warned him if he didn't stop, she was going to let go of the wheel and plant them both into a tree. Mrs. Elam Matthews offered another juicy little grenade when they went to visit her. A week before disappearing, Gettis Lee allegedly said to her,
"Me and Roy Bodden are mad at each other."
Why? Because Sheriff Bodden was supposedly trying to get with his baby. Baby was Gettis's preferred nickname for whichever woman he happened to be emotionally exhausting at the time. In this case, he was referring to Eunice. State Attorney Smiley got word from a hunting buddy named Red Pitts that Gettis might have gotten Quince Keene's stepdaughter pregnant. Naturally, investigators drove straight to Clearwater to ask about that. This incident was in 1952 or 53, and Pitts was in the store when Lee was openly drooling over Lorette Keene.
"I'd give anything to get some of that,"
Gettis Lee had said. She was around 18 at the time. He was 58. Wart Hine, one of Lee's closest friends, confirmed that Gettis always carried a .32 blue steel revolver with a bone handle, and he could shoot the head off a rattlesnake. According to Hine, Gettis once bragged that he had taken Bessie Etheridge, a widow who lived with her father, to the Methodist church and spread her out on the floor. Another time, he supposedly took Eileen Williams into an orange grove for some extracurricular agriculture. The deeper investigators dug into the place, the more the whole town felt like a cheap paperback somebody had left too close to the radiator. Warped, overheated, and full of people making absolutely terrible decisions. Hine tossed in one more nugget before investigators moved on. Eunice Snyder's brother had briefly worked out at Lee's orange grove, but apparently he couldn't cut it, so Gettis let him go. Yet another bruised ego, tossed onto the ever-growing bonfire of resentments surrounding the man. So, investigators moved on to the next woman, rolling over to see the woman that Wart Hine claimed Gettis had once spread like a hot roll he was about to butter on the floor of the Methodist church. Mrs. Hurst denied the whole thing flatly. She said that she had never slept with Gettis. But because every road in this story eventually took a sharp turn toward another rumor, she immediately launched into a completely different scandal involving Sheriff Roy Bodden and her daughter Betty. Mrs. Hurst said that Sheriff Roy Bodden had been sniffing around her daughter while Betty's husband, a Florida Highway Patrol officer, was serving overseas in Korea. Her daughter Betty denied any affair, but gossip had spread that Bodden had gotten her pregnant and pressured her to get an abortion. Mrs. Hurst admitted that she couldn't prove any of it, although in Parrish, proof often seemed secondary to enthusiasm. When Betty's husband Howard got back from Korea, the gossip got back to him, and he confronted Mrs. Hurst about Bodden and his wife Betty's association. Somewhere in the middle of all this, Betty was hospitalized for what records delicately called female disorders. Perhaps unwisely, Sheriff Bodden showed up at the hospital to visit her. That didn't exactly calm suspicions. The scandal eventually drove Betty's possibly cuckolded husband to transfer to Miami. Betty did follow him there, but the marriage only lasted another month before collapsing entirely. By this point, the Lee investigation had wandered so far into the weeds, investigators probably needed a roadmap and a bottle of rye just to keep track of the marriages, affairs, accusations, separations, possible pregnancies, and nervous breakdowns. All of this left investigators with exactly one potentially useful thread: Eunice Snyder and Sheriff Roy Bodden. Naturally, instead of pulling hard on that thread, investigators then embarked on a side quest so convoluted it practically deserved its own soundtrack accompanied by Latin music. enter the Mexicans and Puerto Ricans. Throughout the files, investigators repeatedly circled back to Hispanic laborers working the groves and farms around Manatee County. In 1957, rural America, if authorities couldn't solve a crime quickly, they'd eventually point at whichever group looked the most foreign, standing near a tomato truck. Seems like not much has changed in that regard. Donald Burnett told investigators he saw 2 speeding cars pull onto the highway around 9:40 p.m., March 7th. One carried 4 men he described as black, Mexican, or Puerto Rican, which boiled down to not white, definitely alarming. The second car resembled Gettis Lee's vehicle, and he felt one was following the other based on them both blowing through an intersection, which caused him to slam on his brakes to avoid hitting the second car. That was enough to send investigators barreling headfirst down another rabbit hole, a spicy Latin one. 2 weeks before Merrill Lee's murder, Nelson Overstreet said that 3 Hispanic men had reportedly bought .38 caliber bullets at Palmetto Farm Supply. Now, the hardware store owner claimed that another Hispanic customer was in the store buying a lawnmower at the time, and he warned him that the 3 men were, quote, no good. Or maybe he didn't. That became increasingly unclear after investigators spent what appears to have been several geological eras dragging confused migrant workers, a translator culled from the glut of migrant workers, lawnmowers, and hardware clerks around Manatee County, trying to identify who exactly bought what and where. At one point, they became so obsessed with confirming the identity of a man who purchased a lawnmower that they inspected the actual mower itself, like it was the Rosetta Stone of homicide investigations. And the poor guy they used as a translator during the Mexican thread of this investigation really should have billed the county by the hour and demanded overtime. Investigators bounced from labor camp to labor camp, asking whether anybody remembered a Huffy electric lawnmower that was purchased a year earlier. Eventually, the entire Hispanic laborer angle collapsed under the weight of its own absurdity. It did, however, come with its own bullet fiasco, because of course it did. Every good crime story eventually reaches the point where the evidence locker starts looking less like a secure law enforcement facility and more like the junk drawer in someone's kitchen. This case arrived there at full speed with the siren on. Remember that part about the Mexicans buying .38 caliber bullets at Palmetto Farm Supply? Well, that evidence got re-examined by FBI agents, who quickly noticed something that can only be described as deeply inconvenient. The bullet that Sheriff Bodden had originally handed over didn't match the ammunition later purchased by the Florida investigators for comparison in the Mexican leg of the investigation. The comparison box was bought from the very same shipment connected to the original investigation. It was the last box the store had left from the original 2-box order. Naturally, this sent investigators marching back to local law enforcement with the exhausted determination of men realizing the clown car might be the entire circus. They asked Sheriff Roy Bodden for the partial box of ammunition that Deputy Gill had supposedly purchased back during the original investigation. Bodden's response boiled down to,
I can't find it. Gil probably used it.
the man liked to pass a buck more than Gettis Lee liked to make one. Sheriff Bodden did, however, produce a single .38 caliber bullet, which he claimed came from the original box that Deputy Gill purchased to compare. According to him, State Attorney Smiley had been carrying that bullet around during the 1957 investigation while they drove around questioning Mexican and Puerto Rican laborers. Then, State Attorney Smiley somehow made things worse. He said that he had no idea what bullet that Sheriff Bodden had handed to investigators, but it definitely wasn't the one that he had carried around in 1957, because that bullet was sitting at his house, mixed with his personal .38 ammunition. Federal investigators finally sent the alleged actual evidence offer examination. The 50-round box of .38 ammunition purchased later by state investigators, and the mystery bullet Sheriff Bodden had turned over. The FBI conducted what amounted to a forensic equivalent of holding the two items next to each other under decent lighting. Turns out the ammunition in the box contained copper-coated bullets with brass casings. The bullet that Bodden handed over, copper-coated with a white metal casing. And just to really hammer the final nail into the coffin of investigative competence, the bullets weren't even the same shape. This chapter in the investigation ended with exhausted investigators, stacks of paperwork, and one very confused Hispanic man who was probably wondering why the hell the government was so interested in his lawnmower. Investigators eventually turned their attention to the Gilly land deal, trying to determine whether 60 acres of Florida dirt and a stubborn family dispute could explain why Merrill Lee was dead and Gettis Lee had apparently evaporated off the face of the earth. Keep in mind, this was still late 1957. Gettis Lee was still missing, Merrill Lee was still murdered, and the investigation had all the structural integrity of a dinner napkin soaked in whiskey. Here's the setup. Gettis Lee had been trying to buy the Gilly family property in Parrish. Every heir but one had agreed to sell. Frank Gilly refused, flat out. Wouldn't sell so much as a fence post. And the alleged closing date for this deal? March 8th, 1957. Gettis and Merrill Lee disappeared on March 7th. You didn't need Sherlock Holmes or even a functioning adult brain to appreciate the timing here. Lee's attorney, Mr. Ray, told investigators that he was not aware of any finalized agreement. As far as he knew, no money had changed hands. Ray pointed investigators to John Lavender, a real estate man out of Palmetto. Maybe he could help. Lavender explained that one of the tracts belonged to Mrs. Ray Hankins of the Palmetto Trailer Park, and she had recently asked him to list it. He had a buyer interested and he was trying to untangle the same legal knots. Frank was still refusing to sell. Lavender had known Gettis for 30 years. They had gone to school together in Tampa. But the only recent business that Lee had brought him involved a 10-acre grove tract. When Lavender quoted him $6,000, Gettis replied,
"That's too much. Anyway, I'm asking for somebody else."
Investigators rolled over to the Palmetto Trailer Park to talk with Mrs. Ray Hankins. According to her story, Lee offered Frank Gilly a 10-acre tract adjoining his own property in exchange for Frank's slice of the 60 acres. Frank wouldn't bite. Then, allegedly, Gettis threatened that if Frank refused, he would just buy out the remaining heirs anyway and cut Frank off from the lake and water supply. And we all know that nothing says friendly business negotiation quite like threatening a man's access to water. In her version of the story, Frank was supposed to give his final answer the next day. Will Gilly's version of the land deal was that he had tried to organize the heirs to sell their interests, only to discover that Frank had no intention of cooperating. Will figured that they could sell 5/6 of the property to Gettis if necessary. Gettis apparently either wanted 40 acres or the whole 60. After Gettis disappeared, Will claimed that he ran into Frank at Goddard 66 station.
"Well, that's one sale you didn't make,"
Frank allegedly sneered. Frank denied saying any such thing. He said they hadn't spoken since Will tried to cheat him out of inherited cattle after their father died. Sounds like this family handled inheritance disputes the old-fashioned way. Bitterness stretching across multiple harvest seasons and generations. Frank said he didn't care what they did with their portions, but nobody was getting his. Frank admitted that Gettis had approached him months earlier about buying the property, but Frank claimed it was no big deal. He just told Gettis Lee to go ahead and do whatever he wanted because he personally couldn't afford the family's asking price. Somewhere in the pieces of these slightly conflicting stories was buried the truth, but that line of investigation didn't go much further. Perhaps investigators figured even with Gettis Lee dead, the family was still selling, so that sort of rained on the motive parade. Killing Gettis Lee wasn't going to stop the other heirs from selling, so they moved on. Charlie Williams, owner of the Gulf Station directly across from Lee's store, as well as being one of the Gilly heirs that was willing to sell, told investigators that 3 different people had overheard phone arguments between Gettis and a woman. In one conversation, Gettis allegedly barked,
"Damn your soul. I'm not divorcing Miss Merrill and marrying you. You knew the terms and conditions of our agreement."
One call involved Gettis accusing her of seeing another man. After a long silence, Gettis Lee slammed the phone receiver down and shouted,
"Damn the whole works."
Another argument involved repairs to Eunice's house.
"Your father's there and he doesn't have anything to do. Let him do it."
After another pause, he said,
"Yes, I'll get the paint in Tampa. Just tell me the kind you want."
Another witness, Mr. Pritchard, overheard Gettis Lee saying on the phone,
"I told you from the start I wasn't throwing my wife down for nobody."
Next came Alton Strong, a hardware salesman from Tampa, one of Gettis's closest confidants. Strong knew all of Gettis's girlfriends over the years, and he confirmed to investigators that Gettis suspected Eunice was cheating on him. Perhaps realizing that the circle of gossip and repeated innuendos wasn't getting them anywhere, investigators decided to do some work that probably should have been done early in the investigation, related to that Mercury that was seen parked on Erie Road the night Merrill Lee was killed, by requesting Florida registration records that matched the color description, which was two-tone green. Out of 13,283 vehicles, they initially narrowed the search down to 267 Mercuries that fit that description. Finally, some progress, but it was slow going. They managed to narrow it further down to 71, painstakingly reaching out to each owner, and then finally down to 2. One belonged to a Bradenton newspaper employee, the other a fruit picker. Both men denied being on Erie Road that night. And you're not going to believe this, but that was it. Months of interviews, all collapsing into 2 middle-aged men, politely saying, "Nope, wasn't me." But here's the thing, they only checked vehicles tagged in Florida, which wouldn't help if the perpetrator's vehicle had a license plate from another state. The FSB eventually wrapped up its work and delivered to State Attorney Smiley a tidy, several hundred-page report, already more organization than the Manatee County Sheriff's Office had displayed on the case. But unfortunately, they still had no workable theory, and the incoming tips somehow got worse. 2 Tampa cops, having hamburgers one day, struck up a conversation with a man named Spanglehauer, a former pigeon breeder turned goat farmer, which already sounds less like a witness than a rejected Tennessee Williams character. Spanglehauer told them that he knew Gettis Lee so well he could identify his ashes. He had recently returned from Texas after purchasing a thoroughbred goat. The goat, investigators noted, was present during the interview, as though it might later testify. Spanglehauer claimed that while visiting this mysterious Texas goat farm, he encountered Gettis Lee alive, but sedated, wandering around under the supervision of vaguely ethnic farm workers and a black woman that he thought he recognized from back in Florida. The officers, displaying a level of optimism, frankly, that bordered on neurological injury, continued to ask the man with the goat in his vehicle questions. By the end of the interview, still no explanation was offered as to why Gettis Lee, allegedly imprisoned on a goat farm, had never once asked his alleged old pal Spanglehauer for assistance. The phrase mentally imbalanced punctuated the end of that investigative thread. Months dragged by, nothing but dead ends, bad coffee, and enough paperwork to choke a thoroughbred goat. Meanwhile, the central question remained: where the hell was Gettis Lee? By 1959, the case had devolved into politics, moonshine raids, Bolita rackets, election feuds, grand juries, whispered corruption, and public finger-pointing. Roy Baden was being accused of looking the other way on gambling and moonshine operations in the county, so long as the right people were involved, while making a theatrical spectacle of busting everyone else. Black residents seemed to get hauled in a whole lot faster than the well-connected white, good old boy operators that everybody already knew about. One of Baden's challengers told reporters that Gettis Lee had once tried to convince him to step aside during the 1956 sheriff's race before he was killed. The implication hung in the air like cheap cigar smoke. Maybe there'd been money involved. Then came the Bolita raids. At the tail end of 1959, law enforcement agencies coordinated massive gambling raids across the region, and Sheriff Baden was intentionally left out of the loop. There had been too many rumors about selective enforcement, too many stories about payoffs, and too many Bolita operators somehow continuing to thrive right under the sheriff's nose like mold in a Florida motel bathroom. Neither Baden nor his department learned about the operation until after the doors had already been kicked in and the chips swept off the tables. Then came the funeral bell. On December 29, 1959, Governor Leroy Collins officially removed Sheriff Roy Baden from office for neglect of duty, ending his 17-year reign as the county's top law enforcement official. Federal grand juries convened, witnesses were subpoenaed, reporters swarmed courthouses, and organized crime syndicates slowly emerged from the fog like bloated alligators surfacing in swamp water. The grand jury heard testimony from deputies, investigators, sheriff's personnel, and enough former lawmen to stock a retirement home for angry alcoholics. Roy Baden spent 64 minutes in the hot seat while federal investigators grilled him about possible links between Gettis Lee's disappearance, Merrill Lee's murder, Bolita, gambling, and moonshine operations in Manatee County. The federal hearings themselves disappointed anyone hoping for dramatic courtroom fireworks. No sweeping indictments came down in 1960. Nunez, he had bigger ambitions. He was not interested in nickel and dime gamblers. He used the hearings as a giant intelligence gathering operation, slowly mapping Bolita and moonshine networks that stretched across Florida's Gulf Coast and into organized crime syndicates. Networks emerged, money trails formed, and through it all, Gettis Lee remained missing. But a couple things happened at the end of 1960 that changed the landscape of the case. Gettis Lee's 86-year-old mother died without ever learning what happened to her son. After her death, the newspapers reported that the matriarch of the family had spoken openly to journalists for years, leveling accusations that, quote, newsmen dared not print. One subject she returned to repeatedly was the falling out between Gettis Lee and Roy Baden shortly before Lee vanished. There was no first-hand account of a fight, just gossip whispered all over town, but Gettis Lee's sisters confirmed it was a well-known fact. The two men were at odds because Gettis had caught Roy Baden coming out of Eunice Snyder's house. And with Roy Baden gone, a newly elected sheriff would step into the role, and the case would take another weird turn, with an informant that was pure parish. Interim Sheriff Herman Turner slid into the big chair like the understudy who didn't really want the role. Turner took the reins, trying to steer the sinking ship, until December 1st, when Sheriff-elect Kenneth Gross took the hot seat. During the steamy, mosquito-filled summer of '61, Chief Deputy Clyde Gill got a call from a lawman whispering information that he'd received from posseman Bob Moulter. Moulter was doing a ride-along with another deputy when they stopped a, quote, suspicious vehicle. The car occupants claimed to be undercover agents from Tallahassee, working secret ops on moonshine and Bolita, and they didn't want local law enforcement in the area to know that they were there, According to the agents, they had had bad experiences with Manatee County law enforcement. This kickoff led to months of gumshoeing involving a dodgy informant who only spoke through Bob Moulter, like a bad ventriloquist act. A beverage enforcement agent named Dinkins was sent to look into the matter. He promptly traveled to Bradenton and checked into the Cabana Motor Hotel, awaiting his meeting with Bob. This unnamed shadow of an informant told Bob that a diver had been brought in by an unknown person to dive for the body of Gettis Lee in the pit, which he said was thought at the time to be the most likely place for the body of Gettis Lee to be found. Allegedly, the diver was instructed that if he found the body, he was not to bring it out of the pit. He was just to leave it and say nothing. In the informant story, the diver who found the body met a watery grave himself. Somewhere in the middle of this diatribe, the beverage agent scribbled,
"It is thought by some people that the informer is a little off mentally."
In the end, the informant never sat down with beverage agent Dinkins. He wrote back to his superiors, quote,
"In my opinion, the type of investigation that I have been conducting has come to an end. The informant has refused to talk to me."
At some point, though, Bob had revealed the informant's name, and the agent did some digging. Things then became a little more clear. The agent outlined the two reasons for the informant's interest in the case. First, politics. Second, the KKK. This individual was a very active member of the Klan, and it was very obvious that he was dissatisfied with the Manatee County Sheriff's Department's stance on the Klan activities in the county. 4 months earlier, our informant, aka Eugene Franklin Matthews, was arrested while attending a local Klan meeting. The newspaper reported,
"The gathering before a burning cross of wrapped burlap bags on 2 vacant lots west of US 301 attracted less than 40 Klansmen."
12 Klan leaders were arrested, each held on $100 bond. The Bradenton police chief hauled offenders in on a charge of distributing handbills, which was against a city ordinance. Eugene Franklin Matthews, our adorable little informant, caught an extra charge for stealing 2 documents off the police chief's desk while he was waiting to be interrogated. Eugene Franklin Matthews never had any actionable intel related to Gettis Lee's remains, but as it often does, fate eventually intervened. In Florida, destiny arrived the only sensible way it could. A rattlesnake would provide the next break in the Gettis Lee case. It was May 11, 1963, a little after 4 p.m., when Arthur James Goodson, 34, Joe Roberts, 27, and Joe's wife, Ruby Lee Roberts, were tooling down the dusty Spencer Parish Road after a day of fishing when a rattlesnake shot across their path like it was late for a poker game. One of the men grabbed his shotgun. The 2 men managed to easily tuck between the top and middle wires of the barbed wire fence that lined the property and follow the rattlesnake into a thick patch of palmettos, where it had slithered behind a log. After the shot rang out, Joe Roberts approached the log, making sure the snake was dead. But as he squatted down, he saw what appeared to be a human skull, and on further inspection, he was pretty sure he could see gold fillings in some of those teeth. The 3 left, and after some discussion, the men contacted a man named Harry Sears. They told him the story, and then they all went back to view the scene. After that, Sears called the Manatee County Sheriff's Office. The lawyer told the deputy that the men were frightened and didn't know who to call, so they had come to him for advice. With the daylight quickly getting away from them, as they drove down the road, Gill noted that the area in question had been burned several months earlier, so the ground was visible. When they arrived, the men led the deputies to the area where they had found the skull. Chief Deputy Gill asked the men where the snake was, and one of them grabbed a stick and dragged the dead animal from beneath the log. At that point, Chief Gill ordered everyone out of the immediate area and assigned Deputy Smith to stand guard while he returned to Parrish to notify the office of his findings, and it was decided that they would not be able to effectively search until the morning. Highway Patrol was contacted for a portable power unit, and a bright spotlight was brought in to illuminate the area where the remains of Gettis Lee, still tucked beneath a palmetto thicket, would spend one last night under guard. Conveniently, right around the time that the lights went up, Manatee County Sheriff John Kenneth Gross and the media rolled onto the scene. It was not your garden variety rattlesnake that these fellas were chasing behind that barbed wire fence. It was a biggin. Crime scene images showed the snake draped over that fence like it owned the place, while a squad of white uniformed lab attendants collected evidence, ready to piece together a story written in bones and dust. By late morning, they tracked down Gettis Lee's sister, who fished out a pair of shoes hiding in a closet. Gettis Lee wore a specific type of shoes called massagic, shoes with air cushions big enough to hold a man's secrets. Those shoes are seen in crime scene photos atop a stool, waiting for their time to shine, while the dusty earth gave up its secrets bone by bone. The morning after they found what was left of Gettis Lee out on Spencer Parish Road, the place looked less like a crime scene and more like opening day at a county fair for amateur detectives. The crime scene photos captured it all in that uniquely mid-century law enforcement fashion, black and white, brutally intimate, and with all the subtlety of a blackjack to the kneecaps. Naturally, the sheriff's office had its own photographer there almost instantly, snapping glossy black and white keepsakes like he was shooting a spread for Southern Gothic Monthly. And truth be told, the scene where Gettis Lee was found did get documented more thoroughly than the entire investigation had up to that point. Funny how that works. A man can disappear into thin air for years, and nobody can find enough paper to jot down notes. But the minute his bones show up in the weeds, suddenly it's all hands on deck. There was a new sheriff in town, John Kenneth Gross. Lamar Philpott documented the scene. Philpott had a journalism degree, had previously worked in advertising for the Bradenton Herald, run his own studio, and apparently spent his evenings moonlighting as Death's personal yearbook photographer. Investigators carried Gettis Lee's skull and upper jaw to Philpott's studio so he could take color photographs of them. The resulting images are strangely cinematic. Generators and box fans were hauled in to keep the technicians from melting alive in their full gear, because Florida in May does not care about your forensic ambitions. Gettis Lee's remains were found beyond a barbed wire fence, across 25 feet of grass and a shallow ditch, and nearly 35 feet further into the property itself. The land itself belonged to a deceased man named Cohn, and locals noted that the area was burned off several couple of years as a fire prevention measure, which would have made it a convenient place to dump a body if you knew that, and possessed even a passing familiarity with decomposition. That might suggest a local. But then there was Merrill Lee, who had been dumped half submerged into a canal beside a well-traveled road, her red moccasins sticking up out of the water like somebody forgot the punchline to a very ugly joke. One victim hidden carefully, the other practically gift-wrapped for discovery. That smelled less like one criminal mastermind and more like several people tripping over each other's bad ideas. Crime scene staging has all the grace of a drunk man trying to tap dance, but investigators in this case seemed determined not to notice the tippity tap. Take the money scattered around both recovery scenes. Bills in ones, fives, and tens, coins too. Gettis Lee's money bag was missing from his car. Fine, that tracks. But Merrill Lee had been taken from her home. She didn't bring her purse along. So where did her mystery pocket full of cash come from? Meanwhile, the FBI collected what remained of Gettis Lee's earthly belongings: skeletal remains, burned cloth, cufflinks, shoes, belt, dental bridge, coins, charred paper money, pocket knife, basically everything except actual answers. The bones revealed a devastating blow to the back of the skull, quote, as if some object struck the skull with great force. His face had been shattered too, although, in that case, the fire damage muddied the waters. Then there was his Lord Elgin wristwatch, which became weirdly famous in the press. It had been gifted to Gettis Lee by a girlfriend years earlier, and apparently he liked it so much he had it repaired many times over. Jewelers had practically signed the inside like visiting tourists carving initials into a tree. His trademark hat had bullet holes through the brim and crown, apparently left in the back seat of the car so nobody would miss the point. The FBI found hairs tangled in the sweatband, proving that he'd almost certainly been wearing it when he was shot. The hairs were tinted. Even in death, Gettis Lee liked keeping up appearances. But his glasses, they have never been found. Fibers attached to a bullet found at Merrill Lee's scene matched portions of her clothing. The bullet itself was identified as a .38 Special Slug, consistent with Smith & Wesson revolvers. Merrill Lee had been shot 4 times, mostly from behind. One wound, entered near her left armpit, tore through her lungs and aorta, then exited near her second rib. Another struck behind her ear, one more in her neck and another behind her knee. But then came the kicker. Fragments removed from the wound behind Merrill Lee's ear were tested by the FBI and found not to be copper-coated, like the bullet submitted by Sheriff Roy Bodden, the one that Deputy Gill had allegedly dug out of the ground at the scene. Was the bullet inconsistency, incompetence, or something more sinister? A handwritten list of investigators' notes during this time frame, which appear to be that of J.Z. Stanley, include questions about whether Bodden had ever been questioned regarding his involvement in the Lee case, and why there weren't any original reports of the crime. His notes pointed out that lab reports said Merrill Lee's head wounds contained lead bullets, but the fragments weren't copper-coated like the bullet found by Deputy Gill and turned over to the FBI lab by Sheriff Bodden. This investigator also noted that some of Deputy Crew's observations after the fact conflicted with what family saw at the scene related to the bed linens. Another pressing question: why had Deputy Gill and Sheriff Bodden felt it necessary to break into the Lee house on the afternoon of March 8th if they knew that Deputy Cruz had already been in there earlier in the day? There was no urgency. The house had already been searched. This investigator found it strange that Deputy Gill, Bodden's number 2, had not participated in the search of Merrill Lee's crime scene or Gettis Lee's abandoned vehicle. Were these searches kept from Bodden's number 2 intentionally? This investigator was also bothered by the fact that Eunice Snyder would not submit to a polygraph before she checked with Roy Bodden, and that Snyder herself, among many others, confirmed that Bodden and Gettis Lee were not on good terms before the murders. Thus, surveillance began on Roy Bodden, as well as his buddy and their girlfriends.
Mr. and Miss W. Blitch Smith report that Roy Bodden, his girlfriend Edith Floyd, Clyde Cruz, and Mrs. Helen Wilson meet regularly at the home of Miss Helen Wilson. The Smiths' sleeping porch overlooks the back of Miss Wilson's place with clear view. The Smiths are going away this weekend, and they're willing to have someone stay in the house to watch.
So the neighbor of ex-Deputy Clyde Cruz, girlfriend Helen, signed an authorization for deputies to use his residence as an observation point, quote, to help them in their investigation work concerning a reported prowler in the area. The only prowler here was Deputy Kirk, who was slinking around in the dark, watching 2 men visit with their girlfriends. No word on what their favorite cocktails were. But what this documentation shows is that law enforcement, under Kenneth Gross, was willing to put a lie on paper to justify their investigative work. The report went on.
Mr. and Mrs. Blitch informed me that Helen Wilson, who resides directly east of their home, planted something in the yard of her house at 11:30 p.m. on either the 13th or the 14th of May, 1963.
That tantalizing bit of nothing went nowhere. The surveillance on Roy Bodden, his girlfriend, and ex-Deputy Cruz and his girlfriend really just reads more like a soap opera script than an actual investigation. Nothing came of it. Deputy Kirk also went to speak with former Bradenton PD Chief Meade Britt to see what he remembered from the initial investigation. Britt recalled the scene at the Lee house just after they disappeared. He confirmed that they found the tracks of a car parked in the grove next to Lee's house, and he said they were the prints of two men. Britt felt that two subjects got out of the car and walked through the trees down separate rows to a spot back under the trees, and they stood there for a while and then ran toward the house. Britt said that the scene was handled in a, quote, very slipshod manner. And according to him, from all appearances, Roy Bodden covered up evidence as soon as the FBI turned up. He stated that people at the scene were allowed to walk all over the tracks, and by the time the FBI got there, they weren't able to see them. There was also more information coming in about Albert Kay in Bolita. A black woman named Queenie was selling for him in Bradenton.
Albert Kay is yellow as a dog and would squeal in a hurry if you put pressure on him,
one witness said. But what was important about this witness was that he admitted that he and Albert Kay had constructed a building in Palmetto that eventually became a TV repair shop with apartments upstairs. This building was erected, he said, to handle the Bolita operation in the county.
The Pope boys and several others were making a lot of moonshine, but Roy Bodden took such a large cut, they were working for wages.
By 1964, Gettis Lee's name had begun disappearing from the newspapers. Gettis Lee's name didn't resurface again until 1969. The Bradenton Herald did a story and asked this question: robbery, romance, revenge, or rackets? No motive had ever been established. Witnesses faded, suspects drifted away, politicians fought their wars, and the newspapers all moved on. Had the Lee murders landed in the hands of a sheriff who believed evidence was something to preserve rather than misplace or play political games with, and records were meant to outlive a newspaper cycle, perhaps the case would have stood a chance. Because above all else, Roy Bodden was a politician. Take the famous 1954 photograph. There was Bodden and his local deputy, Clyde Cruz, perched on the courthouse steps beside 30-odd jugs of confiscated moonshine arranged neatly for the camera. The story accompanying the picture in the paper was thinner than a church collection plate after a hurricane. An unnamed farmer claimed that he had spotted a suspicious vehicle in his pasture. When he investigated, 3 mysterious men allegedly scattered into the darkness, abandoning an entire mountain of liquor behind them. No arrests, no suspects, and certainly no explanation for how these alleged mystery men planned to transport enough moonshine to float a small fishing boat in that suspicious vehicle. Just a handsome black and white photograph featuring Roy Bodden and enough liquor to guarantee favorable placement above the fold. Or how about the time just months after another sheriff out of Seminole County, Florida, was accused of taking moonshine bribes, along with another local member of law enforcement in that county, there's another half-page image of Sheriff Bodden, Deputy Cruz, and a state beverage agent about to blast a moonshine still at the scene of a raid. By blast, I mean explode. The man loved a fully covered, staged moonshine raid about as much as he liked frying fish for the cameras. But cameras weren't present in April of 1969. when Roy Boden's former lady friend, Edith Floyd, arrived in court carrying a lawsuit and enough allegations to make even seasoned courthouse regulars sit up a little straighter. Edith was suing Roy Boden over a piece of Longboat Key property. She alleged that Roy Boden had filed a document that purported to convey her property to him by virtue of deceit and trickery. And the witnesses on that document were associates of Roy Boden. The kicker was that Miss Floyd insisted that she had never signed the deed in the presence of either of the witnesses or that notary. The story somehow became even stranger when Ms. Floyd filed suit against Roy F. Boden, aka Arville K. Parkinston. Now, there's a name that sounds like a suspect invented by a lazy pulp novelist trying to meet a deadline. Floyd asked the court to return the title to the property to her, remove the allegedly fraudulent document from the public record, and prevent Roy Boden from further interfering with her ownership. Boden's response was as direct as it was funny.
I'm not Arville Parkinston.
By 1987, 30 years had passed since Gettis and Merrill Lee vanished into history. Sheriff Charlie Wells decided to take another swing at the ghost. On November 6, 1987, 30 years after the Lees were murdered, investigators Kurt Siver, Sheriff Charlie Wells, and Captain Van Fleet of the Palmetto Police Department traveled to Ocala, Florida. Their destination was the home of 57-year-old Eunice Snyder, now known as Eunice Torella. Investigators administered a polygraph examination at the state attorney's office. Captain Van Fleet conducted the test. His conclusion was noteworthy.
Eunice is still evasive in her answers, and it is felt she knows much more about the case than she is revealing.
No confession, no smoking gun, no grand revelation. Just enough ambiguity to keep everyone uncomfortable. Another interview was tentatively scheduled for the following week. Hope flickered, briefly, but then abruptly the trail ended. No documentation followed up this interview. The case file simply shrugged and walked off stage. And so we arrive at the end, or what passes for an ending in the world of cold cases. Whatever opportunities once existed to identify a suspect, establish a motive, or build a prosecutable case have long since slipped beneath the tide. Witnesses, investigators, and suspects are all gone. Rumors, those stubborn creatures that tend to outlive us all, are the only thing that remains. The one thing that does seem increasingly clear is that the twin specters of Bolita and Moonshine probably had very little to do with the murders themselves. Gettis Lee was never meaningfully connected to either operation. Which brings us to robbery. It's tidy and it's convenient, but it's perhaps the least convincing if you look closely enough. If money was the objective, Lee offered far easier opportunities. Instead, someone chose the one location guaranteed to create complications. His home, on a road with neighbors, and a wife inside, another potential witness. Then there's the money. The money refuses to cooperate with the robbery theory. Consider the location where Gettis Lee's body was discovered. Past 31 feet of ditch next to lonely Spencer Parish Road, then another 25 feet or so past the barbed wire fence, where the rattlesnake led the two men. That's where the paper currency and coins were scattered around the scene. At first blush, that sounds reasonable enough. Maybe the money came from his pockets. Except there's a pretty big problem. Gettis Lee's clothing had been burned away, completely. Any bills inside those pockets should have suffered the same fate. This same problem becomes even more pronounced at the Merrill Lee crime scene. Her body was discovered in a swampy ditch. Money was scattered there as well. Merrill Lee had not voluntarily left her home. She wasn't carrying a purse, so why was money laying around her body? Then there's Gettis Lee's car, abandoned near the old Groover store building, found all the way back in the direction he had visited earlier that night. Eunice Snyder lived less than 5 miles from where that car was found. Close enough to be interesting, but far enough to prove absolutely nothing. Perhaps the answer truly was right under everyone's noses all along. Either way, it died with the people who knew it. That's the cruel thing about old murder cases. Time destroys evidence, erases memories, and buries motives. Facts become harder to separate from stories. Stories become harder to separate from the people telling them. And somewhere in the middle of it all, 2 victims never got the courtesy of an ending. Eventually, all that's left are shadows. The shadows surrounding Gettis and Merrill Lee remain as dark today as they were on that stormy March night in 1957. And unless some forgotten document surfaces from the bottom of a dusty box, or a long-lost confession emerges from beyond the grave, that is where they will remain. An unsolved mystery, but one hell of a story.